Dr. Tamara Schwartz, U.S. Air Force retired, is an associate professor of cybersecurity and strategy at the York College of Pennsylvania and an affiliate researcher with cybersecurity at MIT Sloan Interdisciplinary Consortium for Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity, an international cybersecurity think tank. While on active duty, Dr. Schwartz's thought leadership informed the stand-up of Cyber Command and the design of various command centers supporting joint space, cyber, and global strategic operations. Her work at the U.S. Embassy in Amman, Jordan, earned her the 2011 Information Operations Officer of the Year. More recently, Dr. Schwartz was a member of the 2020 Dr. Evil Task Force with the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, identifying future threats to inform DoD investments in emerging technology. She received her Bachelor's of Science in Industrial Engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, her Master of Science in Engineering Management from the University of Dayton, and her Doctorate of Business Administration from the Fox School of Business, Temple University. Her research expertise includes artificial intelligence, cybersecurity as a strategic competitive advantage, and information warfare. Now, here is Tamara.
Okay. So I'm assuming that most of you read my bio on the email, but just a couple highlights. I'm a retired Air Force officer. I was on active duty for 20 years. I worked on the stand-up of U.S. Cyber Command, and the number one threat that my team and I identified was not so much the DDoS attack, which is problematic. I mean, don't get me wrong. A DDoS attack is very disruptive and it's problematic. But what we saw as the ultimate threat was somebody who comes in and pretends to be someone we trust and then influences how we make decisions. Because that is something that's much harder to combat. How do you make sure that somebody doesn't come in and tell you that I'm me, right? Here I am, I'm Tammy Schwartz. What if I'm not? And you trust me. And because you trust me, I give you all kinds of information. And instead of putting your troops on Normandy Beach, you put them somewhere else. And in fact, we know, right, the history of the fake attack that was going on with the rubber tanks and everything during World War II. And maybe if you don't, I'll send a little news article about that for Matthew to share later. But the reason we were able to go into Normandy was because we had created, through the use of some very famous Hollywood folks and fashion designers, in fact, this belief that the military was somewhere else. Well, that was a lot of work and logistics back in World War II. Today, it's not so hard to misrepresent information. And so that's kind of where I come at this from, is from that year those years where we were working on how do you stand up Cyber Command and what does that even look like? So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the cognitive terrain. And what I mean by that is there's much more to how we make decisions than we understand about how our brain works, our personalities, everything else. And then we're going to talk about storytelling, because storytelling is how we as humans collect information in a way that we can share it with other people. And then we're going to finish up with a little bit about what technology and media are doing to our culture and to our brains, so that you understand how this is not all just one thing. This is a much more overwhelming situation than we even realize. Every time I give another one of these talks, read another article, I understand that it's so hard for us to combat this as humans because our brains have never been in this situation. But, just kind of grounding the conversation, I love this quote from the movie Sneakers. There's a war out there, a world war, and it's not about who has the most bullets. It's about who controls the information. And we're seeing this in spades today. Information warfare is having all kinds of impacts that we don't even recognize that's a big key that's going on. One of those things, mental health. You hear about mental health problems all the time. As we get into how information warfare interacts with our brains, you'll begin to understand why there's a mental health crisis. Attention issues. The statistics on attention and what has happened are staggering. Trust, because we have been forced into smaller and smaller in-groups, Our trust in others is decreasing. Our skepticism of others is increasing. Our fear is increasing. Because of the attention capture methods, we feel less safe. All of this stuff works together to mess with our mental health. And because of the way it triggers our brains, it diminishes our ability to think critically and to solve hard problems because it impacts the way we make decisions. And there's three pieces to this puzzle. There's number one, which is us, our people, and how our brains work. Number two is the information itself and the information ecosystem and how the monetization of story and the technology to share story. And then last but not least is the struggle for power, because that's what people do. They struggle for power, and information is just one more domain that we're doing this in. So I'm going to start out with a foundational, this is a military theory, OODA loop. If you've heard of the OODA loop before, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but I'm just going to give you a quick example of how it works. So if I give you the data point 32 degrees, everyone out there instantaneously gives that piece of data some sort of context. And I don't know what context you've given it, but maybe if you're looking outside and you use the metric system, you're going, oh my goodness, it must be really hot out. Or if you are an American, more likely you're like, oh, that's freezing point of water. But the point is, I didn't actually give you anything other than a point of data that has no context to it whatsoever right now. Only that which we give it. And so it could be, and my slides are not changing yet, it could be referring to any number of things. If we're talking about geometry, we could be talking about degrees of arc or an angle. If we're talking about geopositioning, it could be latitude or longitude. If we're talking about temperature, it could be Celsius or Fahrenheit. And so when we are trying to make sense of the data, we're going back and forth between, we make an observation, okay, it's 32 degrees. What kind of 32 degrees is it? That's part of the orienting process. Now, ultimately, why do we even care if it's 32 degrees in Paris? Let's say that we've concluded that the context tells us that what is the most important thing is that it is 32 degrees. This picture with the Eiffel Tower is what matters. We need more context, right? Because even knowing it's 32 degrees in Paris this week and next week is not a particularly useful bit of information unless we're traveling. And then that piece of data then goes into the context of, okay, I'm traveling to Paris, so I care what the weather's going to be like. Understanding the weather impacts the choices I make while I pack. Other things that impact the choices while you pack are why you're going to Paris. If you're going for business versus vacation, you're going to pack differently. And so this is what we mean by the OODA loop, is this idea that we get a piece of data, we have to give it context, and then we make and develop different courses of action, and we evaluate those courses of action based on that data until we take action and, throw clothes in the suitcase in this case. But it's not as simple as putting some data into the decision cycle. We don't just ingest data. We ingest data through a huge lens that is ourselves. And the things that impact that data are our personalities, our emotions. Our personalities and emotions dictate what we find to be important. Our biases do. And so all of these things are constantly working on our brain all the time. And so I pulled some data from one of the presentations I saw Matthew give about the kinds of vulnerabilities that they are trying to identify that deepfakes exploit over at Cyber Labs. So your affective vulnerabilities tie into personality and emotions. Your perceptual vulnerabilities will tie into what you find to be salient. And your interpersonal biases and your social norm vulnerabilities will come in. They're going to be tied to the kinds of biases that form over time. All right, changing slides. Give me a second. It's not popping up quite yet. There we go. One of the things lots of people like to say is, oh, I don't want to make an emotional decision. I only want to make rational decisions. Here's a statistic that tells you that is pretty much impossible. 95% of our cognition happens in the emotional brain. And the interesting thing is that we can't even encode information in our brain without some sort of emotional attachment to it. And if you consider boredom to be an emotion, which it would be, if you're bored with information, you are not likely to remember it. The more the information triggers an emotional response, whether a joyful one or a sad one. There's a movie out right now, right? Inside Out 2. And it's showing how important, the more the emotions are triggered, the greater and stronger the coding of that information is in your brain. And this all ties back to survival. The information had to come in. If we were highly triggered by fear, then that would stick in our brains. It would get registered here in the memory, in the hippocampus. It would get encoded, and then we would remember it. And the next time we felt that same sense, we would react quickly. We'd be able to make our decisions for survival very, very quickly. One of the problems with this survival mechanism is that however the information got encoded, if it was particularly related to survival, the stronger the encoding, the more threatening information that contradicts that coding becomes. And so today, right, back when we were, looking at living in caves and avoiding bears and tigers, that's one thing. But even today, when you have a political perception, and you see this in politics, right? It's, if my candidate doesn't win, life as we know it ends. That's part of this phenomenon where fear being used to message us becomes stronger and stronger, and it makes us more resistant to information that's different from our own existing beliefs. And this is stronger than we even understand. Our unconscious mind processes 500,000 times more information than our conscious mind, and it's primarily emotional coding. The stronger the emotion attached to a piece of information, the easier it is to recall, the easier it is to store. And so emotion is tied very strongly to information that biases us. And so, for example, I like to tell my students I have a bias. I will not eat fried clams. The reason I won't eat fried clams is because I once ate fried clams and had food poisoning for 24 hours, and I can barely sit next to someone else when they eat fried clams today because that right? My brain registered this: fried clams will kill me. And it doesn't matter that intellectually I know most of the time fried clams don't give someone food poisoning. My physical reaction is so strong that it's very hard to overcome that in the brain. That's how we're wired. We're wired that when we have a strong emotional response to something, it is very hard to change the way we are wired and the way we understand that bit of information. And as a result, I haven't had fried clams in years and years. I won't try them because it was that bad of an experience. So your emotions figure heavily in how you make decisions. Another thing we don't think about is our personalities. And our personalities tie to a couple of different things. And personalities are being used more and more. There is so much digital dust out there that it's possible to look at people's activity online and figure out what some of their personality markers are. But to give you just a high level of what personality does, how we perceive information. If you use Myers-Briggs, if everyone's ever taken Myers-Briggs, if you are a sensor versus an intuitor, people who sense need lots and lots of external data coming in through their senses. People who are intuitors, people who come out as an N on Myers-Briggs, they tend to process information internally. So they need less data and they rely more on their pre-existing sense about things. So clearly biases are going to come into play very strongly for both, but it's going to be different kinds of biases. Intuition, people often, if they trust their intuition, they tend to make their decisions fairly quickly because they trust what's inside their head. Introverts versus extroverts, they process information differently. Extroverts process information externally. Introverts process it in their brain. So if you would come out as an I on a Myers-Briggs, you might be somebody who listens for a long time, then goes back and thinks carefully about what you heard, and then you might have a response for someone in your office. Whereas somebody who's an extrovert processes verbally. I once watched this poor Marine. He was a major. He had worked so hard on this presentation about something we were doing in Jordan. And he came and he presented it to the colonel, and the colonel he was presenting to was an extrovert. And so the colonel just kept, every time he would try to talk, the colonel would be talking, the colonel would be asking questions, the colonel would be talking out loud about what he was presenting. And the major felt like he had just been told he was dumb enough for twins and didn't know what he was talking about, and that wasn't what was going on at all. What was going on was that was how the colonel understood what the major had presented, and the major felt like he hadn't done a good job. But it was because the major was an introvert and spent tons of time inside his head, and the colonel had to process it externally. And these are challenges that happen in the office. But they're also part of how what we decide we need, what kinds of information we look for, how much we share information. Another model that's pretty common to be used is the Big Five. Openness. If you are somebody who's open to new experiences, new places, if you like to travel, you like to try new adventure activities, you probably score high on openness. That means that you're going to be more likely to engage with information that contradicts your pre-existing beliefs. Lower on openness means that you are going to be very resistant to things that the lower your openness, the more you are going to be resistant to stuff that contradicts your pre-existing knowledge. The other piece that in Big Five is being used is your propensity for neuroticism. So how driven by anxiety emotions are you? So everyone, and these are all spectrums. So everyone is on the spectrum of each of these five things. Some are higher, some are lower. But if you score high in neuroticism, that's going to make you very distrustful. It's going to make you generally high neuroticism comes with low openness because everything feels like a threat when you score high in neuroticism. So the thing that matters about this is not that there's a good way or there's not a good personality or a bad personality. What it is that you are more exploitable through various means depending on how you score personality-wise. So for example, somebody who scores really high on extroversion and openness might be very vulnerable to misinformation from the perspective of risk-taking. They're going to engage with information that looks risky more than someone who is highly conscientious. But we're all exploitable. And so that's important to understand. It's how you can be exploited that is different, and your personality ties into that. Our biases come into play because they're formed over time. Some of the biases come from our emotions. Some of them come from our experiences. But generally, they fall into 4 different categories. We need to act really fast, so we have to be able to decide like that. There may be too much information, and so we just pick and choose what we want. And of course, we live in a world where there's always too much information. And so things like anchoring bias, which is the first piece of information we encountered, or confirmation bias, finding information that confirms what we already think, that would fall into the there's too much information. Oftentimes there's not enough context for information, and so we look for ways to make meaning. And so one thing can equal a pattern because our brains really like patterns, because patterns mean we can predict, and prediction means we can survive. And then biases come into play for what we should remember. So all the time, these things are impacting what is in our head, and that means that however much we might like to believe that we see what's important, we may or may not. Salience is a concept that is heavily discussed in risk-taking scienarios. So cybersecurity, salience is a big factor, and it's how we perceive risk that salience ties into. But what information you think is perceptually salient. So if it captures our attention, then we believe that it is salient. For example, the Eiffel Tower in that picture, you know instantly that that's Paris because there's something that captures your attention, and contextually it means, the Eiffel Tower is in Paris. So it's contextually salient as well. So the other thing is cognitive salience, and this is where things like confirmation bias come in. We have existing knowledge and experience, and so when we see something that ties into that, we are likely to give it greater weight. We will say, this is important information because it reflects what we know to be true. And then contextually, this other piece to context is, we're looking for something. So we're out there looking for information about cybersecurity programs, and we've got a kid going to college, and we're looking, and so York College might pop up on your screen because it has a cybersecurity program. If you're looking for a nursing program, York College might also show up because they have an excellent nursing program, but you won't even notice that they have a cybersecurity program because it isn't relevant. Or if the only thing you saw about York College was that it has a good cybersecurity program, if you're looking for nursing, you're not going to see that. And so what we give our attention to is impacted by our biases, by our questions, right? Because situational awareness is a step function. We learn a little bit, we want to learn a little bit more, we want to learn a little bit more, we keep changing our questions. But it's a three-way relationship between the observer, the information, and the larger information environment, because we have to choose from this big pot of information what we are going to give our attention to. I'm going through all of this really fast, I know. Another piece that comes into play when we're trying to make decisions is when our brain hurts, when our head is too full. But cognitive dissonance, you hear that term all the time. People's actions that contradict their words. They say, smoking is bad for you, and they're puffing on the cigarette. Right? That's an example of cognitive dissonance. And that's hard for our brains to take. When things don't compute, it's really fascinating to read the journals of Lewis and Clark when they went across the country, because they were told, right, all of their preconceived notions about going to the West Coast said that they could take a river passage, and then there they were in the Rocky Mountains, and there was no river to the Pacific Ocean. And when you read his journal, he says, I know that river's around here somewhere. And he goes and he asks the tribe, the chief of the tribe. And the chief says, no, there's no river. You're going to have to go across the mountains. And he's like, well, clearly the chief doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm going to have to keep looking. And it takes him 7 days of only seeing mountains and having guides take him everywhere till he finally agrees, okay, there's no river that goes through the Rocky Mountains. That's how powerful cognitive dissonance is. He's standing there not seeing a river, and he's sure it's there. And it's interesting to read the journals because you can see how powerful cognitive dissonance can be. Some other things that are making the world hard for us today is the speed of change. Change is hard for us because change means we can't predict, and when we can't predict, it becomes harder to know that we can survive. Uncertainty and ambiguity, they do the same thing to us. We don't know what is going to happen, so we can't anticipate and we can't plan. The complexity, we think we can understand how what's going on and what all of the interactions and the cause and effects are, and we can't. The complexity that exists today exceeds our cognitive limits, even our collective cognitive limits, because we've got these crazy chaos systems where if you fix something here, it actually causes a problem in this other part of the system. And these are things that are very hard for our brains to handle. And when our brains get tired, they say, okay, I'm just going to make my decision. That's where our biases become so much more powerful. The harder it is and the more complex it is, we want it to be easy. We want to just pick. And it doesn't work that way. So we choose what information conforms to what we know. We might say that these two alternatives, when I talk about alternatives, with my students, I explain to them that everything is a trade-off. And so what we have to decide when we're solving hard problems is how much good can we not live without, and how much bad are we willing to tolerate in order to get that good? And that's really hard for them to grasp, because they want something that's, this is the right answer and this is the wrong answer. And the world is just not like that. And yet our brains want it to be. And so if we've got two choices where they're relatively similar, maybe you're buying a car. Once you make the choice, you'll say, oh, wait, no, those choices were actually this far apart, not this far apart. And so these are different ways that our brains rationalize away the discomfort that we have. And our brains will choose things that are salient based on what makes our brains hurt the least, which goes back to if this information challenges everything I already know, that hurts my head. It physically hurts my brain. And so therefore it must not be important. That calms my brain down. So we live in this VUCA world, right? Everything is dynamically changing, but our brains are wired to resist change. Things are uncertain, but we're wired for pattern recognition, and we're very uncertainty averse. The complexity of systems is so extreme that we can't grasp them cognitively. And then ambiguity, things are open to interpretation, but we also have a very superficial understanding. Now, ambiguity is interesting because depending on your personality, you may have a higher or lower tolerance for ambiguity. So if you have a low tolerance for ambiguity, you're going to be more susceptible to the kinds of exploits. That's the neuroticism piece. The higher your neuroticism, the less you're going to be comfortable with ambiguity, the more exploitable you become. So our brains spend a lot of time in the survival mode today. Each of these things I've been talking about, you can probably recognize some of what's going on around you that triggers this. And we're triggered so often, so much of the time we don't even realize it. And I haven't even gotten to the tech part yet. But the idea is that we do our best critical thinking and our best problem solving when we're in our learning brain mode, which requires us to be able to relax that amygdala response. Okay, so you've been collecting all this information in your brain. How do you share it with other people? Well, the first way we began to share information with other people was through cave paintings. Sign language, trying to indicate to people. But cave paintings are information that persisted in a physical way, so that we, even today, if we stumble across this or go somewhere to a museum where it's visible, can see a message from someone in the past trying to explain something they'd learned. So how do we understand the world? There's a contrast between, we have a narrative world paradigm and a rational world paradigm. And the narrative one says that humans are storytellers and that our decisions and communication are based on good reasons. The other view is that we're rational beings and we make our decisions based on arguments. Whoops, wrong button. And so this is important because this is where we are making sense of the information we have. And storytelling is our tool that our brains use. It's how we create situational awareness. We decide this is important, that's not. We decide that all of these things were there, and because our attention was directed one place, we may not see other things. And that's why when you want to get to reality or truth, you need many, many people's points of view, because that's how you get more. What I find salient about a situation may be different than what you or my brother or my dad or my daughter, my dog my dog finds a lot of things that I don't think are salient when I'm out on a walk with her. If you've got a dog, you know what I mean. But storytelling integrates rational data with symbolic interpretation, and those narrative arguments we make, they compete based on values. And so we actually do both. What is a reasoned argument except a really good, persuasive story? And the best stories follow these things called master plots. Now, I know you're probably thinking, what does this have to do with the cognitive terrain? Well, these master plots, we are acculturated to them globally before we are even verbal. And because of that, this is in the back of our mind. This is part of how we frame story. This is when we evaluate a story to see if it feels true. And so there's two things we evaluate a narrative on. One is the probability that it could have happened, and the other is the fidelity. And the fidelity comes from these master plots. Who's the hero? Who's the villain? Stories about rescuing. Stories about puzzle solving. We all love, in America, we love the underdog story. Stories of sacrifice. These are not just plots that go into movies. These are plots that are in the newspaper every day. They're plots that come across your social media feed. And so because these are in our brain from an early age, we see a piece of information, and if it follows this, our brains say, oh, this must be true. And so that's a really important thing to understand, is that this storytelling stuff wires our brains. It becomes part of that decision cycle. Another piece that I had not thought about how much it relies on story is identity. Personal identity, who we think of ourselves as, and social identity, who we think of, what we think it means to be something. In particular, a nation state. Even something as physical as territory is really based on a story. And how that story was captured. If that story was captured in a map, right? There's reasons that we have territorial disputes. Because one person captured the visual narrative of the territory definition differently than someone else did. We have stories about our history and how we tell those. We have, think about if you ask two people from the United States, one from the state of Texas, one from the state of Oregon, and one from the state of Massachusetts, to define what it means to be an American, you would get three pretty different definitions. They might overlap in a couple of places. But because of the way we understand stories and the way we read stories, it impacts our identity hugely. And that difference in identity, that preconceived definition of identity, is one of the things that will make it possible to exploit any one of us with the right kind of information can be weaponized to exploit our understanding of these stories. So something that has become, we've always talked about the power of persuasion. But one of the things that has changed in this day of massive data collection is something called neurotargeting. So we've got three pieces to a good persuasive argument. One is the reasoned argumentation, the logic, the coherence, the structure, the logos. One is the ethos, which is the credibility of the person or the data sources, their reputation, their expertise, their trustworthiness. how good they are on stage, right? There's a lot of people who are great on stage and they may know nothing, but you still believe everything they say. And then last but not least is the emotional resonance. What has happened is because we have so much information out there, there is an ability to create a picture of not you in particular, but all of us, a picture of what our identity is, what our personality markers are. And so because of that, the emotional resonance card can be played and is being played. And the term that I saw in the article I read the other day was weaponized pathos. The idea that we have weaponized our emotions in our writings to a point that has made it very challenging to be a human today. This quote, "A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree and he turns away because his emotions have been triggered, his pathos. Show him facts or figures and he questions your sources, the ethos. Appeal to logic, the logos, and he fails to see your point." And so what this tells you is that pathos is more powerful than ethos and logos. And that's why it's been weaponized. So bringing back the personality thing and how personality can be exploited. High neuroticism is very vulnerable to fear messaging. Low openness creates extreme fear of the outgroup. So outgroup messaging, again, triggers that pathos and can be very successful in making somebody believe something. Conscientiousness, the lower your conscientiousness, the less likely you are to verify your sources, and so ethos becomes sort of a non-issue. Agreeableness, if you're low on agreeableness, you're more vulnerable to outgroup demonization, because when you're low on agreeableness, you tend to have less empathy. And so you would be much more vulnerable to outgroup demonization and schadenfreude, which again is getting to the emotions, joy at the pain of others. And so these are ways that some of those affective vulnerabilities can be exploited. So what else is going on? Storytelling is the essence of how our brains connect to create information. The media, right, the stories, technology allows us to share stories differently and further. Media monetized stories to figure out how to share them and profit from them. And when this is going on, there is this massive feedback loop where the technology and the media change society and society changes these things, and it's all in this big mutual reshaping scenario. Some examples of major social impact. When the printing press was invented, we see not too long after that the Reformation of the church. When the linotype press was invented and it made it super easy to monetize and print a newspaper, we saw the massive monetization of story, massive climb in the media industry, and that was when the extra read all about it, and a lot of the techniques that are good at capturing attention began to come into play in the information ecosystem. When the TV was invented, right, not when the TV was invented, but when it became ubiquitous, when it was in most houses, that's when we see the civil rights, the civil rights movement, and you saw people become anti-Vietnam War protesters because they now had access to information about things that they could have turned a blind eye before there was a television in the house. And so this goes on and on. You see this happen over and over again. So what are some of the big things that have changed lately? Well, the internet, plus the ability to write blogs, plus the cell phone, then now the smartphone has given rise to something we call the citizen journalist. And unlike the Edward R. Murrows and the Tom Brokaws of our past, who tried very hard to give an unbiased presentation of what was happening by triangulating to truth through many, many sources, the citizen journalist has no such set of values governing what they put out there. And so we have lots of people with lots of intent on trying to, and everybody has a story to tell, and everyone has the ability to tell it. And so information warfare, which was largely in the past the domain of nation states and maybe some really, really big companies, anybody can tell a story now. And I just gave a presentation to StratCom a couple weeks ago where I was talking to them about counter space and some of the narratives they're going to be going up against. One of the things we know, there's tons of billionaires launching stuff into space, and they're going to have different strategic interests than nation states about what goes on up there. Citizens are going to have different strategic interests, and because we don't know what kind of impact launching spaceships is going to have to the climate, they're going to run into the environmental narratives that are going on. And so this is something they didn't have to worry about in the past with launching satellites. No one was thinking about the impact to the environment. They were looking at how satellites could be used to look at weather down on the ground. The way that these gazillionaires think is very different from the way the other 99% think. So this idea that there was a narrative couple of years ago when Jeff Bezos bought his yacht, and he wanted them to take down the only bridge that hadn't been destroyed in World War II in Rotterdam, and it's a national landmark. And he didn't think twice about asking to have a national landmark taken down to get his personal boat out. So this is not normal thoughts. And when you look at what citizens think of this, imagine, I told them, I said, here's a narrative that I can spin off the top of my head. The gazillionaire community, the less than 1%, is causing environmental damage that harms everybody else on Earth. So now you're getting into the fight between the everyman and the 0.5%. So that's a thing that has been different. And so this is just one example of how there's many people who are going to have opinions about what goes on in space, and that's going to make it very difficult for the US government and the Space Force to make decisions, because there's going to be a whole lot of other competing narratives out there who are talking about their view of what the Space Force does, and that's very different from the past. Next piece is the rise of social media. We all are aware that social media is channeling us down into smaller, we call them the echo chambers. But these echo chambers, another word for echo chamber is in-group. And the red and blue is a study where it's showing how the in-groups and out-groups people are being divided more and more. It started because the way you make money with social media is by engagement. And so you certainly wouldn't want everybody to see the worst of society out there, because they wouldn't have stayed engaged on the platform. So they started by creating these algorithms to move people away from the worst parts of the internet. But those algorithms are deep learning, so they educate themselves over time to narrow and narrow and narrow. And TikTok is probably the one that does it best. TikTok doesn't look at just what you engage with. It looks at what you engage, what you like, how long you engage with it, what you dislike, how quickly you disengage with what you dislike. And because of that, TikTok has, I think last time I saw the records, it was somewhere around a 57 minutes per day in engagement with the platform, and the next closest one was Facebook with like 37 minutes. And so that tells you how powerful that algorithm is in funneling you down into just what you want. And so this has implications for society. It is creating greater tribal behavior, and that's exploitable. This quote from Xi Jinping when Biden was being inaugurated really was telling. Democracy is dying because it requires consensus, and it's very hard to get consensus in the world that we live in. And so he believes that only autocracies are equipped to meet the extraordinary challenges, probably because they can reduce how many stories are being told. there's only one story that's allowed to be told about this industry in China, but there's many that can be told here in the US. Last but not least, there's attention capture, right? We talked about salience. How do you get people to decide and perceive the information and that it's important? And the two things that are most effective are fear and novelty. And you right, everyone's trying to outdo one another with stupidity on social media videos, or the world is ending tomorrow, according to the news. Even you want to really see it, watch the Weather Channel, because it's really funny to read the headlines on the Weather Channel, but they really highlight the whole fear thing, and it's one word isn't enough anymore. And then last but not least, this little device, every time it sends an alert, it triggers your amygdala, your fight or flight instincts. So fear is being used to trigger us because people want our attention. And this constant alerting and all of the anxiety that is being spewed onto our brains. In 2000, 12 seconds was the attention span of a person. In 2015, it had dropped to 8 seconds, and I'm sure you've all heard the 9-second attention span of the goldfish, just because that's interesting. But last April, I saw some new research that indicates the attention span of Gen Z is 2.8 seconds. Think about that. That's one of the reasons it's so hard to teach them in the classroom. Because if you don't keep them highly, highly engaged, you lose their attention instantly. But this 2.8 attention span requires more fear to capture attention, which then decreases. And so this is the world our brain is living in right now. Be afraid of everything all the time. The alerts, even though they're not frightening, they function the same way some sort of indicator in your environment would function to trigger you to, oh, there's a bear present. The in-group, out-group thing, and then all of the things like COVID and elections, and everything is changing so fast, and everything is uncertain and ambiguous. And so we've become so complex that our brains are always in a state of distress. And there's outcomes from this that have to do with things like empathy, because empathy requires more cognitive load than apathy. It has to do with, we're just much more exploitable than we have ever been, and this is only going to make it worse, right? This is the next major disruptor. And because it learns a bit, the better it gets, the harder it's going to be to detect the fakes. And our brains are not in a state of relaxation where we can function from up here all the time. They're mostly triggered back here. And it's not good. It's not good. So here's a little shameless self-promotion, and I'll take questions.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation to the Cognitive Security Institute. You may learn more about topics in cognitive security by visiting us at cognitivesecurity.institute.